Now, welcome to another edition of HAMAA Live. Today, we have an awesome guest in celebration of the 188th anniversary of the end of slavery. We are having an esteemed guest, Dewitt Lee, who is in charge of who runs the Emancipation Month International Organization, the Emancipation Month mission, so to speak. And he's out here to bring more education to the world about the history of emancipation, the many figures that were involved through that process, and generally to try to bring the community together. I've known this man for many years, and he has done amazing work in the community, increasing solidarity, cooperation between organizations, and most importantly, he does bring the youth in to make sure that the youth have an opportunity to participate and share in this mission. So I'm going to add him to the studio here, and I will let him speak. Welcome to the show, Dewitt.
Thank you. Thank you. Good to be here, Chief. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you very much for coming on through and taking your valuable time out through what I would assume is the busiest month you have of the year. Please do tell us a little bit more about the Emancipation Month International Organization and the mission that you are on and why it's so important.
Well, thank you again for having me. You are no stranger to the work we do commemorating emancipation through Emancipation Month and throughout the other initiatives of our organization. So the name of the parent company is called Caretakers of Our Culture. And so Caretakers of Our Culture is the organization that has brought forth Emancipation Month, has brought forth Black Veterans Day, and many other days, weeks, and months of historical significance as it pertains to people of African descent. And it is a true torch. You know, it's a torch relay, right? So I just picked up the torch from others who have been carrying this mantle and this responsibility. This is our history. We have to control the narrative, right? We have to make sure that we are also ensuring that the messaging is reaching the masses and it's not just enclosed to a few people in a room, that it finds its way into the movies, it finds its way into the classrooms, and it finds its way, especially online. So I want to just thank you for doing what you do online. We've actually gave you an award for Emancipation Month for your work online because you are putting forth and projecting those images and that messaging that is going to spark the imagination and interest in the generations, and I'm just looking at the artwork behind you, what a moment in time. What a moment in time, freeze frame moment in time. And the question is, who would you be in that photo? I was trying to figure out which one of those guys would be me, and it's like, we've all had to pick up whether it's arms or in this particular case, a torch to move our people forward.
That's a beautiful answer. And it's really important to make sure that we consider the fact that not only are we carrying the torch, but there's an old saying, right? We don't own the world, we just borrow it from the future.
Mm-hmm.
So, we carry the torch for now, but that's only because the generation coming after us can't carry it today. So I think it's really important that you continue working through this project or this mission, so to speak, and continue bringing that education on towards for everyone. So, what inspired you to start this mission, and what can it tell us about the history of emancipation?
Well, the start came from a stop. I felt a great calling to raise the red, black, and green flag here in Canada. And it never been done. And I've never physically been responsible for one either. So, for me to get a call to do something that I've never really done before was terrifying, right? And and so I think, on the other side of fear is great reward. And I didn't know that, but I just knew that I was given an assignment and I put the request in. The city of Toronto. It seemed like it was pretty self-explanatory on how to, have a flag raising, or to schedule a flag raising. And their response was no, and their response continued to be no as I, would share more and more evidence of people of African descent, primarily in the U.S., using the flag that was gifted to us by the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey and the UNIA ACL in 1920 as a symbol of their unification and liberation. More unification, right? The word liberation has, I think I may have used it a few times in the past, and it kind of really caught on. But it's a unification flag. It's a flag designed for people of African descent all over the world, who all consider Africa their origin, to be able to be united under one flag. There was a song back in early 1900s that said every race has a flag but the coon, right? And you could listen to that after this interview on YouTube. You could type that on YouTube, you can hear it. And that song played on the radio. And it made fun of the fact that we didn't have a flag. And so that caused the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey and the other members of the UNIA to make that part of their agenda item, to decide what three colors were going to represent our flag. So the city of Toronto told me no on numerous occasions, back and forth emails, and finally they said I could do it. But it was deep into August, right? So I picked the last Sunday in the month of August, 2016, and it gave me about a week and a half to spread the word that we were going to have a flag raising. And in the meanwhile, I needed to find a way to connect August 28th to the 1st, because we've never celebrated Emancipation Day beyond Emancipation Day. And so I doing my research just like you do. There's so much hidden in doing our research. And doing my research, I saw the actual copy of this British Act, and it's in fact said that the law was signed on August 28th, 1833. So that Slavery Abolition Act was signed August 28th, 1833, but it didn't go into effect to August 1st, 1834. So in that moment, I said, you know what? This is going to be called the closing ceremonies of the first Emancipation Month. And then months after that, years after that, we were able to get cities to offer proclamations, and now we have a law passed in the Ontario legislature.
That's phenomenal. I mean, I've been watching you do all of this amazing work over the years, and to get it this far, and I think you had a park renamed in Brampton as well. Is that true?
Well, there is a park in Brampton called Emancipation Park, and what we were able to do was the history of that is simple. We got into the political space. I'm a political guy, right? I ran for mayor in 2010 and 2014, and decided that I would be best served as on the outside, helping people win elections. And we put together an organization called the Black Voter Base and formed what was called the Plan of Equity and Inclusion for African Canadians. And it was a 17-pillar proclamation that said, these are the things that we need you to any candidate that we approach, that you have to agree to these terms in order for us to support you, to be able to go back to the Black community and say, this is why we support this person, not because of emotional support or his kindness or her kindness, but straight up and down commitment to helping us achieve our goals. And one of those goals that we submitted was to have an Emancipation Park, because we have to have land, we have to have space to be able to create and to inspire and to teach and be athletic, and but most importantly, a place on the map that's ours and not borrowed. Right? Too many times these flag raisings take place on borrowed flagpoles, and it has to come down in a day or in a week or in a month, and it's not enough. So fortunately, the city of Brampton had a mighty advocate on their board and visionary on the board named Charmaine Williams, who championed it. in city council. And actually, she picked the park, and we were kind of hung up on what park we wanted to pick. And sometimes, sometimes, and I would have never picked that park. It was too big, And so, sometimes we kind of get humble, and and we all fall victim to shrinking a little bit, maybe. And this park that she picked was, was one of the biggest parks in Brampton, a sports park, and so that passed anonymously, and there it is. And so it was during COVID, so we weren't really around. So the public wasn't around, but government was still, still in operation. And this happened. This happened during COVID, and so very excited to see it manifest. And we've since adopted it. So that sign there says "Adopted by Emancipation Month International." We do park cleanups in the park, and we do history lessons and teaching in the park. We do pen in the park. And August 31st, we'll be doing our third annual Emancipation Cup soccer tournament, and flag raising, and on our own flagpole. Because after the park was renamed, I went back to City Council and requested them to pay for some flagpoles to be installed. And after I chose the location of those flagpoles, the flags went up. And then we had a special ceremony, not to get too far off track, but but just to give you an idea of how caretakers of our culture has really grown into a year-round history organization, is we found out that November 7th was historically recognized as a day that a proclamation went forth in America that was written by a British governor named Lord Dunmore. And this proclamation went out to the enslaved Africans of America that if you would like to join the British Army, you'll be rewarded with your freedom if you win. And once I came across that fact, the event was rebranded to a Black Veterans Day, the first annual Black Veterans Day, because it's the first time that we were in fact able to, in North America, join the military, right? And also earn our own emancipation. And I think that story is very prominent and very important to be shared right now, because, our first emancipation came through our own sacrifice, right? We were the instruments of our own emancipation. We were the cause of our own emancipation. We earned our own emancipation. So before a law was passed that gave it to us, we were able to fight and earn it for ourselves. So that park is historically recognized as the only park in Canada as Emancipation Park. And then shortly after, Afro Sankofa put out an open bid for artists to create some of the artwork. And I'm so glad that you have some of the artwork there. And you see the symbol that's there in the park is also the symbol on our flag. That's the Emancipation Month flag behind me. And that symbol is an Ndinka symbol, of course, meaning after emancipation comes responsibility. So it's not just like an emancipation symbol. It's a symbol for an action after emancipation. And that's where we need to really focus.
And that's really important, because freedom doesn't mean anything if you don't do anything with it. Because freedom comes with responsibility, right? You get your freedom, but with freedom comes the requirement to be able to make decisions for yourself, to become a leader, to prop up good leaders, and to really be involved. And I think that's amazing. Can you tell us a little bit more about the flag?
Sure. Well, just another point, in poverty is, the poverty, that's something that we have to be emancipated from, right? Like this, this month is about looking at, all the areas that there are still chains, and we're still prohibited from being manifesting our full greatness. And I think poverty, the chain of poverty, that still holds us back from being able to be self-reliant, self-determined, and self-independent. And that's what we want, right? We strive for it. We bought into a country dynamic that we wanted to, we wanted this country to win. We wanted all the countries that we're in to win. And, we bought into the philosophies, and we were hoping that we would in fact be able to, that the things that they wrote down in these documents, would ring true. And if we did our part, then, that would manifest. And so, and we also, we're terrorized whenever we try to create our own, whether it was Black Wall Street, and we were, alienated when we try to create our own schools. They want to know why we have an Afrocentric school, but there are Jewish schools, right? And that's appreciated. I mean, there's Catholic schools, right? So I mean, there are schools for specific interests, and this is not us being racist. I mean, these are the things that we hear about when we try to step out and be independent and create for ourselves. So this flag behind me is part of the international flags of people of African descent. That's the Emancipation flag. This is the Black History Month flag. This is actually the 30th anniversary Canadian flag here with the Sankofa on it. And so, of course, it's built off the foundation of, the red, black, and green given to us by Marcus Garvey. And we added some details to it that tells a broader story of the Black experience. So we know red means the bloodshed. And this black line represents travel. So all the black lines, I should start here. All the black lines represent travel. Okay. This black line represents when we are the captains of the ship. We're talking about the Moors traveling. And this here is when we were actually captives on ships. And so the black line here that creates this smaller red stripe, right? That represents the eternal intergenerational trauma that we experience. So if red means the blood, this represents that internal, emotional, intergenerational pain and trauma that we still experience. We know black represents the black people. And this black line I mentioned represents the transatlantic slave trade. And so what that did was it separated this green, which is Africa, to a diaspora. So this green strip here represents the diaspora. And there are many things in here to teach, a more robust. There's symbolism in here to represent the Egyptians. There's symbolism in here to represent, this journey that we're still on, the sun and many more things to learn from. So it's a teaching tool, and it's a contribution to the world, and it's Black Canada's contribution to the world. Just like, Emancipation Month. The great thing about Emancipation Month is that it was birthed here in Canada, right? And this is something from the Canadian diaspora to the rest of the world, right? We've imported a lot of cultural institutions and ways of expressing ourselves, from Kwanzaa to Black History Month, right? Black Music Month, all these different things that we saw happening, and we said, hey, we could do it here. Well, this is something where we can say, hey, we started this here, and now this is how you do it over there.
That's beautiful. I love it. I love it. I love the fact that we have something that's being created, for example, in Canada, that can now be spread throughout the world as part of the global Black experience. I think it's really important as well to remember, as part of that history is, as you mentioned, the Black loyalists who fought for the British Crown, who were established in Nova Scotia, some of whom living in Nova Scotia would have been Maroons that would have been brought to Canada from the Caribbean as a result of the Maroon Wars. Just so much history layered on top of more history.
And those who were enslaved in America, they had an option. You can either go to Nova Scotia, you can go to Britain, or you can go to Sierra Leone, right? So Freedom Town in Sierra Leone, this colony was founded by people who were enslaved in America, fought with the British, and survived that Revolution War and made their way to to Sierra Leone, to a place called Freedom Town. And from what I've read, is that one of the leaders of that movement in that colony there was George Washington's former, enslaved person. So, he was one of the first to be able to say, hey, I want to fight with the British. And, and that put pressure on the U.S. to finally allow Black troops, right? So there was definitely a ripple effect. But also it's important to note that Emancipation Month was also Black Canada's contribution for the International Decade of People of African Descent. So that went from 2014 to 2024. And the whole world was put on notice. Here's a decade. Do everything you need to do, say everything you need to say, get it out your system, put it on the table, and go get it, right? And we were supposed to really use that time to find out how we can heal, how we can recover, what this reparation conversation is going to look like. And to me, I didn't want to be left lacking. I didn't want my country to be left lacking, but I just felt like since I was here during that time, what is my contribution, right? Everyone, can just focus on their own contribution and great things can happen. So to me, it was a personal challenge to myself. What is it that I can say was my contribution during that decade? And Emancipation Month is one of those things.
That's beautiful. I love it. I love every bit of it. And as we're talking about that history, that historical inspiration, can we talk a little bit about some of the historical figures that have inspired you to go on this mission and that have inspired you to keep going despite any of the roadblocks that you might have encountered through this process?
Well, of course, the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey. I mean, I've probably read more of his books than anyone else. So I mean, he is someone who I constantly refer to as being an inspiration. There's a gentleman named Prince Hall, who has a whole set of Masons named after him, the Prince Hall Masons. He is a mighty man of valor and bravery. And obviously who can not be inspired by, Harriet Tubman, and Josiah Henson, right? So these are people who left us their stories to be inspired by, right? These are people who actually wrote about their experiences. Booker T. Washington, right? I mean, I constantly think about what he went through to just to find out if this educational institution was there. He heard a rumor about it on a plantation that there's a school for colored, and he decided to go walk 500 miles to find it, and avoiding death and sleeping under all kind of crevices and finding work in between. And when he got there, he looked beat up. He didn't have a place to go sleep and get some refreshes what he's wearing or take a shower or anything. He just showed up as he was. And fortunately, the people at the school, they saw him and they didn't judge him, and they gave him an opportunity. They told him to clean the place. And he did such a great job cleaning the place that he ended up getting an invitation to attend. So, just those stories of fortitude, those stories of believing and trusting what God tells you, from Nat Turner, being inspired by a vision from God, from Harriet Tubman, being inspired by God. Like, Frederick Douglass's greatest, one of the quotes of Frederick Douglass I say is, me plus God is a majority. And that's been my attitude in every room I step in, regardless of if it's just me there. I always feel like I'm the majority because I've God on my side. So, those are some. But of course, when you think about Grenada, where my mother's from, and we think about the Jewel movement out of Grenada, and what they're attempting to do was inspirational. The leadership in early Ghana days when they put the Black Star on. I mean, these are all people who helped carry the torch and did something to leave a mark that today's generation, relies upon and sources so much strength from.
I think that's beautiful. And again, it's these are people who carried the torch at their time, and they were borrowing the world from the generations that followed us. And now it's our responsibility to carry that on another generation. And I think it's really important to remember the names of these individuals. Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Booker T. Washington, all of these different people, Viola Desmond, who all put in that work. I believe there was one as well, Marianne Shadd Cray, who I think was the owner of the first printing press in Canada, right?
And she's actually the award that you received is named after her because she used media to get a message out. So I was going through countries and I felt like I was also going a little long. So I guess I should have probably started in Canada. But I started off with my top 5 dead or alive, and
yeah.
and so but definitely Viola Desmond. One of the things that we do in September is we have a Viola Desmond Seed of Sacrifice campaign. So we actually have theaters We reached out to theaters and we asked them to dedicate one seat to her, and we have a poster made, and we commissioned a poet to actually to put together a poem for us, and we made a video that plays in the pre-roll before movies, so that people know why that seat is being saved. And it's actually something that inspired me in the States when I saw a seat that was covered with a sign that said, "This is in dedication to Rosa Parks." And I said, you know, if they're going to put aside a seat for Rosa Parks on the bus, then we're going to put aside a seat in the theater for Viola Desmond. So, I mean, we're talking about a Black woman being on a $10 bill, right? In Canada. Like, this is one of the greatest moments ever. And, you know, and the question is, what are we doing with that piece of history? Like, you know, like that can't be ordinary. It's not ordinary. You know, people in the United States, they're blown away, you know, by the idea that there's a Black woman on a $10 bill before them, right? So that's just a sign that, you know, here in Canada, you know, we have a special opportunity, and that gives us a great responsibility, right? And so the world is going to be looking towards Canada, you know, just like our ancestors are escaping slavery in America, finding freedom in Canada. So Canada has been called Canaan, right? They called it heaven, right? Where freedom lives. So we're going to be held the most responsible because we've been the most free, right?
Yep.
People were partying in St. Catharines, like Black people were partying in St. Catharines. Black people in Canada were running for office for William Hubbard, right? William Hubbard was sitting in city council, okay, when across the border, Black people were still in chains on plantations, like at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So it's important for us to understand that we've had freedom for a very long time, or some degree of it for a very long time. And, you know, the question is, have we not done the most with it? So we're here to push the envelope. I'm inside the headquarters of the Toronto Paramedics headquarters. They gave me this little button here. They had an Emancipation Month event today, and I was the speaker. And we had a flag raising. The flag went up, and it's on their flagpole right now. And they actually have an ambulance. Check this out. Check this out.
Oh, I need to see this.
See the red, black, and green on the ambulance? And right here, we got the flag. And underneath it, it says, "Celebrating Emancipation Month on an ambulance." To God the glory. That's all I can say. To God the glory. So, but I spoke here, and I talked to them about the first ambulance actually company was founded by Black people. It's called Freedom House. Google it, Freedom House, and many of them knew about them in the room. And I found out that earlier this year they brought the founders and those responsible of Freedom House Ambulance here to the Toronto paramedic space. And they actually started the first ambulance, the concept of an ambulance, and then they ran into a lot of resistance and ended up disbanding. But history recorded, it's too late. You know, they're already in the history books. It's too late. It's already been documented. So so to be able to build off that great history is what we're trying to do. You know, and being Black without borders, I think that's key. Is that we're able to channel inspiration from around the world, and it's time for us to inspire the world.
That's amazing. Now, if we're talking about being without borders, and we're talking about all of these different organizations that you're working with, I'd be really interested to know, and I'm sure that our viewers would be interested to know, who are some of the key players that you worked with as you were starting this mission, and who are some of the key players that are helping you grow through this process now?
That's a great question. I will say, without hesitation, that one of our ancestors, who's my dear sister, Akua Walcott, from the Harriet Tubman Community Organization, she was a great inspiration. You know, and you have to remember, when I finally got the city of Toronto to approve the raising of the red, black, and green, I had about a week and a half to spread the word. I had no time. And I called her and I was terrified because once again, this is something that I don't really have experience in, right? I never orchestrated an event like this. So I wanted to reach out to people who I know truly knew the community, right? Because it's important for the community to be there for that, right? There's people who have dreamed of this, and for them to not have a front row seat at it happening would have broke my heart, right? So I was concerned about who wouldn't be there. And I did my best to reach out to all the leaders that I felt like could get a message like this to the right people. And I learned a lot about my people, and I learned that people are motivated and fueled by a lot of different things, and it's not all good things, And I learned also that this is a pretty lonely journey, and if you don't have your family, if you don't have a strong base, then you'll seek approval and accolades and from the outside world. And, that could leave you wanting, and that could leave you depressed, but I say I do it for the cause, not the applause. Right. So, to me, I'm not motivated by, ego or accolades. I just have an assignment. I'm just a soldier, right? Like I'm just a soldier. I've been given an assignment, and, my only concern is that I get the job done. So, so I will say, just because I have an opportunity here to acknowledge, I would say I found a good brother named Dennis Scott out of Burlington, Ontario, who has been in this battle, in this war for some time. And he recognized, the work that I put in, and, and to have his support meant a lot, to have his support meant a lot to me. And even leading up to this place, when I ran for mayor, it's a gentleman named Garnett Manning out of Brampton, Ontario, who really spoke life into me and spoke to me like I was a sure win to be mayor. And just having someone talk to you and give you that kind of confidence, made such a big difference in my life. So, I'd say we've had a lot of great allies in the political space because that's what fueled this, right? Is that, I guess pivoting from being a mayoral candidate and building allies and maybe a few enemies in the political space, I knew that much about the political space that if a politician is saying it, then people are not going to question it, right? So it was important for me to get Emancipation Month proclamations in as many cities as possible, right? So that I can then give it to the people and say, you have permission to have Emancipation Month, right? Like you have the right and now the responsibility to celebrate it. So, a lot of allies in the political space, a lot of people who go unseen and unappreciated, but were able to help me get the audience of mayors and of high-ranking politicians, right? I'll never forget, a sister who helped me speak with the Prime Minister of Grenada, right? And she could have pushed me away, but she decided that she was going to allow me time with him, right? And the fact that she was a handler of the Prime Minister, so the fact that she allowed me time, he knew that I was worth the time, right? Because she wasn't angsty, she wasn't pulling me to the side, she wasn't saying, she just allowed me to speak to him about Emancipation Month. And we're proud to say that Emancipation Month is now celebrated in the U.S. It's now celebrated and recognized in St. Lucia, right? And working on getting other countries around the world, because Emancipation Month is not about just what happened under, the British rule and regime. It's what happened about the global experience. So we're talking about Brazil. We're talking about the Arab slave trade, right? We're talking about, any passage of slavery that took place and identifying who was responsible for it, right? So this is a global month of commemorating the African liberation. And we never had that, right? The world never had that. a month dedicated to the global conversation about emancipation and reparations. So, and now we do.
And that's really important. And I think that's a good and noble goal to make sure that we have this conversation globally, because slavery, as we are aware, especially if we're speaking only in the context of chattel slavery, didn't happen just in the United States. It didn't happen just in Canada. It didn't happen just in the Caribbean or in South America. We have places in the world where there are open air slave markets today. We have places that only ended their slave trade in the 1980s, and it is an ongoing process in order for us to be able to take a look at how we can broaden that conversation so that more people can be included. And I think
And
it's
more
also
people could be held responsible,
exactly,
right? I
exactly.
mean, like there is a cause and a rightful cause for a reparation conversation,
Mhm.
and through Emancipation Month, we've created a week within this month that commemorates um, 8 mornings of mourning. So it's 8 mornings of mourning, which commemorates 8 different passages. So it's called officially it's called the rites of passage of Christians of African descent, and it takes us through passages in the Bible. And that's where history is. You talked about history. I know one of the things we're going to talk about is why is history important. Well, why is Black history in the Bible important? Right. One of the last areas that we've ever focused on, and learned about. And fortunately, we have this ancient book that has our ancient beginnings in, and it tells about our role and our, even when we read about the story of, um, Yeshua carrying the cross. They say, it was passed on and given to a man who, and they identified where he's from, and it's an African country, right? So it's like Africa was there, right? I mean, Africa has always been there even from the birth. His birth, it says an angel came down and told Joseph, his father, to take him to Egypt, right? So we were there, from the beginning to the end. So it's important for us to identify ourselves in that book specifically.
Right, and it is a global story. I mean, we can go all the way back to the period of the Zand Rebellion in the Middle Ages, one of the longest and largest slave rebellions in history, larger than I would argue the Servile Revolt that happened in ancient Rome. You had the rise of the enslaved African soldiers, farm workers, etc., who fought against, I believe it was the Abbasid Caliphate in modern day Iraq. And that lasted for years. In fact, there's still a very large Afro Iraqi population around Basra. Then, of course, you can take a look at the multitude of revolutions if we're staying with the theme of the group of revolutions. I believe leading up to the end of slavery in the British Empire, there were somewhere around 225 slave rebellions or revolts or armed insurrections in the course of 100 years. So it's definitely a wider, more important conversation to have in the context of not just social justice, but understanding history overall to see how different things are aligned and how they come together. So I think that's a brilliant step and a brilliant take, especially looking at the very spiritual influences that people have around the world. Let's talk a little bit about the future.
Yeah.
Where do you see this project in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? When Dewitt Lee III has retired from public life, where do you see the Emancipation Month mission?
Well, Emancipation Month has a lot of components to it, and it's a year-round experience, right? So we created a calendar, so the caretakers of our culture calendar, which we hope to be able to have it emerge in schools. We hope to have it emerge in public life. So we've identified like 3 major areas: the business sector, the religious sector, right, and of course the government space, right. So there's obviously a very sensible and legitimate government space, right, to have it officially recognized as government. But it's important that we maintain ownership, right? Like Emancipation Month is a trademark. I trademarked it, right? So, so that we can control it, right? So that we can protect it, most importantly, right? Like, and these are the things that we have to do is we have to, things that we create, we have to protect, right? Because, once I retire, I hope that one of my children are inspired to carry the mantle. They've all been to flag raisings. They grew up in flag raisings. They grew up in marches. They grew up in, in all those activities that I do. So I hope that one of them or more than one of them sees a role in playing. But hopefully, it's all about creating jobs and making people's workspace equitable, right? Because slavery was a work thing. It was a work issue, right? I mean, obviously, we know the personal, the personal anguish that we took in the division that existed because of it. But ultimately, it was a work thing, because these people who enslaved us, they could have gave us $1 a day, and it wouldn't have been slavery. It'd have just been a bad job, right? It'd have just been a bad paying job, right? But they refused to share anything with us, right? They refused to give us anything. And then even after it was over, they refused to give us anything, right? So this is a wealth issue. This was a wealth gap issue. This is an employment issue. And so, we care deeply about those who are still, enslaved in mines in Africa. We care deeply about those who are still falsely imprisoned because of cannabis. And there's, and cannabis is now being sold on every corner in Canada and North America, right? So we care, so we talk about the future. The future is what this modern day slavery and racism look like. The racism part, for those who are part of, we call ourselves, the emancipated and educated, man, because, we feel like, based off of some prophecies that we believe came true. Genesis 15, read it. It's very simple. You don't have to be a scholar to understand it. And I think that's the way God wanted it, for these signs and for these things to be able to be read and understood by people who don't have someone to interpret it to. There's a thing in the Bible where, an Ethiopian eunuch, had to find a disciple to say, explain this to me. I don't understand this. Right. So, I don't believe God will make things so complicated that you need to find someone to explain it to you. So in Genesis 15, it said very plainly and simply, for sure that your people, and this is a message to Abram at the time, know for sure your people will be enslaved for 400 years on a foreign land. And after those 400 years, I will judge those nations and you will leave with rich possessions. Okay. All right. Simple. Know for sure your people will be enslaved 400 years on foreign land. After that, I will judge the nations. You will leave with rich possessions. Very simple. So we know 1619, August 20th, 1619. It's argued that that's one of the first times, and we have it recorded history that enslaved Africans arrived in America. Okay. So fast forward 2019, that's 400 years. Pretty simple, right? What do we have the next year? We had COVID, brother. Right. And if God's getting credit for the floods and the pestilence and everything else, like, and we just stopped giving him credit for these things. So obviously it's a horrible thing to happen, but so was the flood in Noah's time. Right.
Well, what we can say is, as for HAMAA's perspective on that, we can't judge one way or the other, but I do understand the sort of the way that these things might be connected. And I mean, slavery itself in the Americas is such a complicated part because when we talk about the arrival in 1619, I think oftentimes what's left out is the fact that the Spanish had slaves in Jamaica in the early 1510s.
Right.
So, and then there was slavery in Florida in, I think, about the 1510s, 1520s. So even then, we're talking about a really long timeline.
A really long period of time. And, and the timetables can keep moving, but we're saying, you know what, this 400 years, We know what we were doing those 400 years, right?
Absolutely.
We know what God we were serving, right? We
Mhm.
know what we went through, especially the last 200 years in honor of this God, okay? And and we know that that this experience that we're going through right now, we believe has an expiration date, right? Like we believe that what we can now focus. We need to focus on us. We need to focus on healing. We need to focus on unifying us. Like we're a scattered diaspora, a very powerful diaspora, and we
Mhm.
need to focus on us. And we spent a lot of time trying to convince people to embrace us, right? And stop being mean to us, right? And stop trying
Mhm.
to withhold things from us, right? And it's time for those things. It's time for us to get those things, and it's time
Yep.
for us to be the head and not the tail, right?
I think
So,
it's important to always remember that if you can't get a seat at a table, just create your own.
well, this is what we did, right? And
Mhm.
so, and the thing is, the people who are sitting at that table, right? It's there's a lot of things that we have to deal with. We haven't even had time to dialogue with each other, right? So to have a table full of all those who deserve to be at that table, right? When are we going to get a chance to build and work out our own issues, right? Because there are things to be worked out on. So this expanded period of time of emancipation celebration, like I said, does covers a lot of the things you talked about. Those slave rebellions, I mean, that's hidden history, right? That we have to find a way to make a curriculum, right? So that's why, again, I credit you for all amazing work that you do to reconnect us to these historical times in history that have gone forgotten about, but are keys into our history and who we are, and are part of our makeup. And we have to make sure that it is protected and preserved for generations to come. So I think ultimately there are some areas of ties of things that we're still in bondage with, right? And that's why we still wear the chains, because there's still things we're in chains from. During this week of our mourning, we're fasting from tobacco, we're fasting from sugar, we're fasting from coffee, right? Three things that are primary slave crops, things that we were snatched off the continent for and stuck on plantations for, and they still have an addictive chain to it. They still have an addictive property over it, and we're still enslaved by it, right? So we want to address all those areas of our lives where we feel like there are still existing chains, and we need to break it. And so it's a spiritual journey, and it's very physical, physical experience, as you can see as well, and mentally.
Excellent.
Because the Honorable Marcus Garvey says we must emancipate ourselves from mental slavery, right? So if we spend all our time talking about, the physical chains that we're in, and we're not spending any time talking about any of the other chains, then we're still going to be in some sort of bondage.
And it's very important. I do agree that the conversations do need to be expanded. We need to have wider examinations of the various things that affect populations, especially after leaving such a long period of bondage, not to mention the social, political, and financial fallout of that hierarchical system. And so that's why projects like the Emancipation Month movement, all of the community work that you've been involved in, and of course the importance of spreading that education is so vital to continuing that healing and growth process. Uh,
Thank you. I will say there are a lot of organizations that do the work, and so what we want to do is we want to honor those organizations. I just spent some time in Guelph. We're on a Pan African, our Pan American, Emancipation Month flag tour, and we visited Guelph at the Guelph Black Heritage Society, and they have a beautiful facility called Heritage Hall, and they're doing amazing work in that community, preserving churches. So during Underground Railroad Month, in a month from now, we're going to be working on a national campaign to try to raise money to preserve these churches and preserve these places of historical significance. So we're asking all the communities around the world that on August 31st, we're starting off with looking for 400 communities to take part in the Emancipation Month 400K. And that Emancipation Month 400K involves 400 communities who are going to take a 1K walk through their community, or around something that needs to be protected and preserved. Do an assessment of it. There's cemeteries. There are, so many underground railroad sites. There are so many historical buildings where Marcus Garvey spoke or Bob Marley performed or things like that. Like there's places that we need to preserve, and we need to identify these areas and make sure that they're around for generations to come. So on August 31st, the International Day of People of African Descent, we're asking for 400 groups of people around the world to pick up area that they want to showcase to the world as saying, hey, this is our Black experience here in this part of the world. So, we have people in Brazil, we have people all across the islands, we have people in Ireland, right, who are going to be doing this 1K walk, filming it, sending it to us so we can put together this collage of videos of what the Black experience looks around the world. And specifically all of these slavery arrivary locations. So there are markers at ports all over the U.S. That have markers, and so we're going to have our walks concentrating there. And I'll be doing the walk at Emancipation Park. So hopefully, when I see you come down to the park, you can get some steps in and be part of our Brampton leg of the Emancipation Month 400K.
I definitely need to put those numbers in my pedometer, so I will do my best
man,
to make sure that I am there.
We all do.
So as we come to the end of our interview, I want to ask you: do you have any final thoughts that you want to share with the community, or any relevant links, events, organizations, people that you want to shout out? Anything that you want to finally share, or a last message for our viewers?
Well, I'd say, every movement needs music. And I want to thank all the musicians who have contributed. Suzette Vidal on steel pan. She is, always there with her pan to share her love for this incredible instrument made by Black hands that was created in Trinidad. To have Liberty Silver sing the Black national anthem, which is the anthem used for this flag raising, is always an honor. She also, Liberty Silver, is our 2026 Emancipation Month Queen of Canada. So we created our Emancipation Month Queens, and they're regional. And we have a beautiful list of somebody from Queen Rita to Queen Stacy, Destiny Savory, who became one of the longest tenured Emancipation Month Queens, to Andrea, to now Liberty Silver. Is a great honor that these women would cast a reflection that I think the youth, especially young Black girls, need to see. We started having this event at Queens Park. When we were the first to raise the red, black, and green at Queens Park, many occasions you attended. We were like, well, what about our own queen? Right, we're here at Emancipation Month celebration at Queens Park, and we don't have, we wanted to have our own queen. So our flag is raised by our queen. The Emancipation Month proclamation is read by our queen. We march. We'll be marching, God willing, in the Labor Day parade in honor of the sleeping car porters. So we transition right from Emancipation Month right into September, Labor Day, marching in honor of the Brotherhood of the Sleeping Car Porters. And then we just continue, to preach and teach. So if anyone would like to participate, we have, they can find us at Caretakers of Our Culture on all social media platforms, or of course, Emancipation Month. They could find us there. And we even find a way to, always approach things with a Pan-African perspective. So, grateful to Kente Claus, who always, the Chief Joy Distribution Officer, who sends toys to Africa and the Caribbean islands, making sure that the stories of Africa and in the Caribbean are infused and, in the imagination of the young people. And so, just finding different ways to reach different levels of our community. And it's all about partnerships. So we're here to build, we just recently partnered with the Caribbean Canadian Trade Summit and Investment Summit and Trade Forum. So they put out a special discount to their upcoming trade summit. And it's the Emancipation Month, sort of promotion, right? So thanks to organizations like that who see the value of Emancipation Month and want to create things that we can promote and that can help push the narrative. So grateful to all those kind of partners to help make this thing a reality each and every day.
Thank you very much, Dewitt, for coming through and sharing the hard work that you and the community have been doing to spread the message of Emancipation Month and all of the weight that remembering events like the transatlantic slave trade and global slavery hold on the world as we have today. And it's really important, again, I say to everybody watching, that we engage with history, trying to understand what and why, and that we try to figure out what we can do to make the world a better place, not just today, but also for tomorrow. And we need to do it as a community because, as the proverb says, if you want to go fast, you go alone. But if you want to go far, you go together.
I say.
Thank you very much and have an amazing night.
No doubt. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
All right. Peace.
Peace out.